And finally, of course, they, in general, the human rights approaches we have so far have tended to focus on the obligations of states towards their citizens. In that respect, again, as in other ways, they reflect, in many ways, the principal global documents. They reflect the time when they were being drawn up 40, 50 years ago. They don't focus on the rights, on the obligations of corporations to respect human rights, or of governments outside the country in question. Often the infringement of human rights in a particular country may occur not so much from the government of that country, but from other governments. And they don't sufficiently apply to international global organisations. So they've got strengths and weaknesses, and that's why, for me, one of the most important things one also needs to push for is exemplified by the Millennium Development Goals. And that's what we were doing, flowing on from the Social Development Summit process that Anna George referred to. Australia played quite a role, partly through ACOS and through Oxfam, in pushing for what eventually, a few years later, became the Millennium Development Goals. We believed that it was important, amongst the whole array of ambitious targets that had been adopted at international level, it was important to focus on a few that should be regarded as of special priority, should be couched in terms that were specific and monitorable, that were ambitious but not crazily unrealistic, and that had deadlines. And that's what I think one could say about most of the Millennium Development Goals, which came through the international process of negotiation in 2000 and have been gradually, I think, rolled out very effectively by the United Nations as a way of encouraging development. So they focus on things like halving the proportion of people who are living on less than $1 a day as a measure of reducing poverty, reducing child mortality rates by specified proportions by 2015, maternal mortality rates, achieving universal education for girls. They focus, I think, very well on some issues which are important for two reasons. One is in terms of gender equity, so maternal mortality and girls' education are very important from that point of view, but also that are catalytic in other ways, that if you achieve those goals, you will probably achieve other things, and girls' education is a classic example of that. To use the current vogue for economic analysis, the multiplier effect of expenditure on girls' education is very large. So I think that the choice of the targets for the Millennium Development Goals was sound, and that they helped to give teeth and life and focus to the much broader statements that you'll find in human rights treaties. And in that sense, I wouldn't say they've been more effective than the human rights approach, because I think they need to be pursued together. But I do think the broad statement of values and aspirations of a human rights approach does need to be accompanied by much more specific and monitorable targets. Of course, another value of the targets was that they especially focus on the people in greatest need and the countries in greatest need, on the developing countries. And that's by contrast with some of the human rights treaties, which can be a little vague. But they're not they leave developing countries relatively free as to how they'll achieve these goals. One thing we need to be very careful of, I think, in developed countries, even if we like to think that we're very sensitive to the needs of developing countries, is not to tell them too much about exactly how they should achieve goals. And from both the broadly speaking right and the left, there can be a tendency sometimes to want to intrude too much in how developing countries will actually achieve outcomes, and to impose on them standards which they don't have the resources to achieve, and largely, or to a significant extent, don't have the resources because of actions by countries like ours. And that's one of the main weaknesses with the Millennium Development Goals, which we criticised at the outset, and that is that in their initial form there were 7 goals which basically were talking about outcomes that were mainly of relevance to developing countries, like improving mortality rates, etc. And they were specific and time-bound, but they weren't matched by 7 specific and time-bound, or however many you want, commitments about resources to enable those developing countries to achieve those goals. They were very one-sided. So we proposed an anti-poverty pact, which would have those 7 goals, outcome goals, and 7 specific commitment goals, mainly impacting on the developed countries, to do with official development assistance and debt relief and trade measures that would help the interests of developing countries rather than just of developed countries. Also things to do with the responsibility of the states themselves, so reducing arms expenditure, reducing corruption, etc., to enable the resources to be mobilised more effectively. We weren't successful in that push, although what did happen is that there is now an 8th Millennium Development Goal, which in a very vague, non-specific, non-monitorable way talks about the importance of doing something in the areas that I just mentioned. But that reflects the fact that you see so often in all the WTO negotiations and elsewhere that you get specificity and enforceability when it's in the interests of the developed countries, or when it won't hurt the developed countries, but you won't get it when it's going to be an obligation on the developed countries themselves, and that's the weakness of the Millennium Development Goals. But I think they are very important to give teeth to human rights treaties, and indeed you could regard them as a way of giving some justiciability to it, in that you could say, well, if a country is failing to meet the targets under the Millennium Development Goals, then that prima facie is an indication that they're in breach of, say, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. They can then argue why they haven't been able to do it, and that can be assessed. But if you want to give more teeth and justiciability, more ability to really argue the case in some forum about the human rights treaties, that may be a way of doing it. Well, finally, and very quickly on regionalism. I think regionalism has not had enough attention in discussions of global governance, and that it's one of the most promising aspects of our attempts to get effective global governance. So I think one of the ironies or paradoxes is that in some ways the answer to the problems of globalisation is more globalisation. Our problem is we have unbalanced globalisation, that we haven't been able to impose at the international level the degree, imperfect as it may be, the degree of constraints on rampant short-term economic behaviour and manipulation and exploitation that over a century or so we've managed to achieve in countries like Australia. Instead, that's been eroded by the march of globalisation. We need instead to get forward and try and get more of these international standards in place to achieve what used to be achieved by national law but can no longer be done so effectively because of the impact of globalisation. But much of that can be taken forward at the regional level. It will often be easier to get agreement, and especially specific agreement at the regional level, because it's easier to avoid the problems of being utterly inappropriate than at the global level. By and large, regions tend to be somewhat similar in their economic and social and cultural circumstances. And it's more possible, I think, to have agreements that have some potential bite. It can also help to strike the right balance between what can end up as excessive uniformity or domination from afar of a global approach, or on the other hand the impotence and the parochialism of just being national. Regionalism, the EU is the most obvious example, but others are developing to a greater extent than we realise in Australia, in most parts of the world. And I think they hold the future, great hope for the future in a number of ways in terms of strengthening international governance, not global immediately, but international cooperation, and also in enabling developing countries by coming together in regions to fight for a fair go on the global scene. It always strikes me as odd that so many developing countries don't seem to have a strong drive to coming together in effective regional groupings, and yet you look at the extent to which much more powerful countries in Europe recognise that they couldn't get a fair shake in the global scene unless they came together in the EU. So they gave up some sovereignty, apparent sovereignty anyway, to come together in a regional grouping and be more powerful globally. Well, if they had to do it, surely developing countries have to do it far more. And I think that their top priority really should be to come together and cooperate far more in regional groupings to try to then go forward on the world stage. And I think that's also important for Australia. I just finished by saying that I think Australia's role in particular in that area, we're a rare country and it's a bit hard to say what region we're in, but I think we're mistaken in trying to describe our home region, our basic region, as Asia or as Asia Pacific or as East Asia. I think, for reasons I'm happy to elaborate on discussion, that our home region is Southeast Asia and the Pacific, by which I mean the Pacific Islands, and that we should very strongly try to interact and cooperate with and strengthen the development of that as a region, and regard relations with India and China and Japan and other places like that as another issue, but not seek for them to be part of our home region. Thanks.